So, I picked up the phone and I went, "Hello, Lewis." So suddenly there's silence in the room. "Oh, Lewis Hamilton." So I said, "Lewis, hi." He said, "Hello, Matt." I said, I'm not in Hockenheim." He said, "I know you're not in Hockenheim. I've just heard this minute," and this was 11 o'clock at night. "I've just heard this minute that your mother passed away today. I just wanted to call you straight away and tell you that I wanted to pass on my condolences. Are you with your family, by the way, Matt?" I said, I am. He said, "Could you please pass on my condolences to each and every one of them, and also tell them that I will remember your mother in my prayers tonight." So I sometimes, as a racing pride person, I go to teams and say, you do realize that if you embrace this properly, you'll make your car go faster. And I firmly believe that. There's lap time in the generous acceptance of diversity and inclusivity. Yeah. And I have to pay tribute to Felipe Massa here. He just kind of squeezed his way through and put his hand up and he said, "Well done, Lewis. Can I shake your hand?" And, what a sportsman. What a fantastic occasion. But it's often described as Lewis Hamilton's triumph, and it was. But it's also a story that, for me, places Felipe Massa among the greats.
Mr. Bishop, welcome to the channel. It's a pleasure and an honour to have you on. I'm sure we're going to have a wicked conversation. How are you keeping, sir?
I'm well, thank you very much. And how are you?
I'm okay, thanks for asking. You're the first interviewee that's ever played the question back to me, and I suspect that comes from your journalist background, F1 racing, which we will come to in short order, by the way. But Matt, listen, mate, as an introductory question, tell me a little bit about yourself. Everyone will know that you work for Aston Martin Cognizant, the F1 team, that you're head of communications, I think, there, and you've worked with W Series, F1 Racing, McLaren, Ron Dennis, all that good stuff. But give us a cheeky summary for those guys who aren't as acquainted with you as myself.
Well, I think you just gave a cheeky summary, so we will settle for that. But yes, I'm currently Chief Communications Officer of the Aston Martin Formula One team, which has been a Formula One team for 31 years. It started off as Jordan. Then it became Biker and Force India and Racing Point. And then only just a year and a bit ago, at the beginning of the 2021 season, it became Aston Martin because Lawrence Stroll, father of Lance Stroll, bought it and had also bought the Aston Martin car company and wanted to put them under the same name. And he hired quite a few people to try to lift the team to his higher ambitions, because he has limitless ambitions, Lawrence Stroll, and I was one of the people whom he hired. So Aston Martin made its return to Formula One for the first time for 61 years, because Aston Martin had actually raced in Formula One in 1959 and 1960, but only people who are either old or have an interest in the history of Formula One know both those things. And I tick both boxes. I'm old and I have an interest in the history.
Learned, Matt, I think is the adjective. Brilliant. Okay, let's, I've got a question to ask you right off the top about your role at Aston Martin. I'm going to get straight into the weeds of it. I don't know if you saw the Red Bull's response to the rumour that your guys had taken some hints, let's say, from the Red Bull design concept, that they were on the pit wall with all kinds of green Red Bull cans, being very cheeky as Red Bull are. How do you manage that, Matt, as the head of communications? Do you just kind of no sell it, radio silence? Like, what's the play there, Matt? Because
to be honest with you, I have great respect for Red Bull. I regard them as fast and hard on track and fast and hard off track. Absolutely. And I've known all the people there, or most of the people there, for a very long time. I've known Helmut Marko, Christian Horner. I would regard Jonathan Wheatley as a friend. So look, I know a lot of them. And I wasn't that surprised because that's how they go racing, on track and off track. But that's not an insult. They've been hugely successful in doing that. There are some physical similarities between the two cars, but there are also, once you actually start looking at it, there are so many differences as well. But I wasn't at all concerned. Some people said, were you concerned? I wasn't at all concerned because the FIA, the governing body of the sport, had spent 2 days poring over our car and all the designs and all the instructions to fabricate, to make to send the designs to the fabricators to make the body parts. And, in all sport, the referee's decision is final and you play to the whistle. Absolutely. And the referee is the FIA, and the referee had made their decision, and therefore we played to the whistle. And, as I said, once at the time, once that became a bit of a feeding frenzy in the media for about 24 hours, but then immediately the FIA issued its statement, which was an unequivocal clean bill of health for our car. And as I said, I spoke to some of the journalists who were there, and they said, well, this is now a non-story. This is now a non-story. And you'll notice that it is now a non-story. Absolutely. And Red Bull have got on with doing what they're very good at, which is competing well on track as well as off.
Absolutely. Really well put, Matt. So, okay, so if I take a step back then, and I want to reference your time at F1 racing potentially, or frame it in this sense. So there's almost a paradigm shift at the moment going on in F1 as far as journalism and the way that we ingest that F1 content. With the digital revolution and everything obviously used to be hard copy with autosport and F1 racing. Matt, how do you think F1 as a sport is embracing said revolution? And do you think, with your PR cap on, that F1 could potentially, F1, the commercial rights holder, FIA, not so much, of course, could potentially do more to embrace that?
I think everyone's playing catch up, and I don't just mean within the sport of Formula One. I mean in sport in general. I started off as a journalist when everything was either television, radio, or on paper. There was no such thing as a website. There was no such thing as social media. Nobody ever did anything on their mobile phone other than talk and listen. And things have obviously revolutionized in that time. In the 30 years I've been involved in Formula One media, they've revolutionized massively. And I think the two things that Formula One has embraced in a big and successful way yes, I think they have with social. When I say Formula One, I mean everyone who plays on the field of Formula One, all the drivers, all the teams. Formula One itself has embraced all the social media platforms. And, a lot of Formula One drivers, teams, and indeed fans, they live their lives as Formula One entities on Instagram, on Twitter, and so on and so forth, and increasingly now on TikTok and so on. Yeah. And I think it's quite interesting that fans probably a little bit more Instagram, drivers too, and teams probably a little bit more Twitter, and journalists a little bit more Twitter. But the whole thing works together. So there's that side. I think that, yes, that has changed completely how you have to story tell in Formula One. You used to be able to think about the deadlines of a print journalist, package up a story for him or her to write, sort out the interviews for him or her to do, and then wait for him or her to write it and for it to be published, and then you'd see it the next morning. Of course, that story line or that timeline of storytelling has been compressed into seconds now, literally seconds. And quality journalism is still important, but time and speed is arguably as important or more important, perhaps even, certainly as important. So I think that's changed things, but I think the sport, in my view, has tried its very best to keep pace with that and has embraced it. The other thing is the revolution in television. Of course, television, people still watch television, but young people don't watch television in the way that people of my age do, or people of my age did when I was their age. People now watch moving pictures on all sorts of other platforms, and Netflix, of course, is a major one. And Formula One's embracing of Netflix has been super successful, super successful. Drive to Survive is a phenomenon, a force of broadcasting nature. And we're now on whatever it is, the 4th or the 5th series. There are people who criticize it. It does have its critics. Is it religiously dogmatic in the way that it adheres to the plain facts of every storyline? No, it isn't. But then it doesn't pretend to be. But is it an important adjunct to the way Formula One is brought to the masses? And does it bring Formula One to a wider constituency of masses, perhaps at different ages, perhaps in different territories, particularly the United States of America? Yes, absolutely. And that's very important. I think the teams are still working out, and I think we are, Aston Martin, still working out how to play in that playground, because on the one hand, you do want to be part of the story, but on the other hand, you don't want to be part of a story that's been twisted a little bit too much. So that's not a criticism either. That's just the changing face of the way the media is these days. And Drive to Survive, I believe, is here to stay, and I welcome it.
Love that. So much to pull out there, Matt. Let me ask you a follow-up question. I've read some of your bits and bobs and have your debut novel, obviously, for the camera, which we will plug. Guys, if you haven't bought that already, definitely go and buy that. The Boy Who Made a Difference, obviously by Matt Bishop. All that money goes towards a good cause. Of course, I think in your mother's name, right, Matt, if I remember correctly.
That's correct, yes. I actually have a copy here, so I shall also hold it up.
Let's go. Phenomenal book.
So there you are. That's The Boy Made the Difference. It's got nothing to do with Formula One. So I will just say, if anybody who is, planning to buy it thinks they're going to get a whole lot of Formula One anecdotes, they're not. It isn't that kind of book. It's available on Amazon and, Book Depository. It's available in bookshops if you want to order it there. And it's available in paperback and Kindle formats. And anyway, look, I won't go into massive detail because this is a Formula One interview primarily. But yeah, my mother died of cancer in 2013, very sad. And she was a novelist. And when she died, I set up a charity, or rather a foundation, an appeal. Her name was Bernadine Bishop. And I set up an appeal called the Bernadine Bishop Appeal, which fundraises for a charity that was in those days called Click Sargent, but is now called Young Lives versus Cancer. Much easier and more sensible name, but it's the same charity, Young Lives versus Cancer. And obviously, it's pretty obvious what that does. It campaigns to help young people with cancer and their families. And, I haven't got kids. I'm never going to have kids. But I can't imagine anything more awful than for a parent to be told that your little boy or little girl has cancer. I mean, I don't want to depress everybody watching or listening now, but there can be nothing more ghastly. So I thought, if I can keep my mother's memory alive by inaugurating a foundation or an appeal, and if it can raise money for such a worthy charity, what a great thing. And I thought there was a novel in me, so I wrote the novel. I wrote it between McLaren and W Series, so I wrote it between 2017 and 2018, but it was published in 2020. These things take a long time to come about, really, sometimes. But it's nothing to do with that. It's what does it say? I mean, it says that it's I'll just read this terribly short bit. It says, the opening premise is the starting gun to a rollicking ride through London of the late 80s and early 90s in a literary novel that focuses on human frailty, love, marriage, family bonds, gay sex, betrayal, alcoholism, illness, and death. Although aspects of the novel are richly ironic and even comedic, it also deals with challenging themes not least HIV/AIDS. That makes it sound incredibly depressing. I promise you it's not.
It's punctuated with comic relief. It's a really good read, and of course the links will be in the description, so definitely go and grab one of those. Before we come on to some heavier topics, Mr. Bishop, I just want to reference your, I suppose I get this from Mr. Windsor, your ex-charge at F1 Racing, that you're a storyteller and a wordsmith, Mr. Bishop, clearly in the way that you communicate in the book. You see it, that you lace with French wherever possible, of course. Do you think storytelling through literature or works of literature is a lost a lost art in F1 because of the digital revolution and the fact that everything's come online?
I think that's an interesting question, and I'm hesitant to agree with your premise. And I'll tell you why, because that would be uncharitable to some wonderful journalists. And I won't name even any of them, because if I name 2 or 4 or 6, I'll forget the 8 or 10 or 12 that I should add to those 2 or 4 or 6. But I have a lot of friends that I've known in Formula One for a long time, and some new friends that I've known in Formula One for a shorter time, and I respect those journalists enormously. Some of them are natural wordsmiths, if you like. And perhaps some of those are people who've been doing it for a little bit longer, because the form of a magazine article or a newspaper article over 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 words lent itself to the weighing of words and the agonizing over the cadence and the rhythm of prose. And that isn't necessarily something that's essential when you're writing a tweet or an Instagram post or a TikTok caption. And that doesn't mean that those things are less important. It's just different. You know, everything changes. Languages are not dead languages. Well, Latin and ancient Greek are, but the languages that people speak now are living things. And we don't speak English the same way as our grandparents spoke it. One might think that one does, but actually you don't. There's different phrases, there's different vocabulary, there's a different approach. And it all is valid. So look, I personally loved the challenge of sitting down in front of a typewriter in my early days and coming up with a 2,000-word piece. But I still like my tweets. I still like writing a 280-character post. But I weigh my words as well, even then, actually, to be quite careful. And I'm very cross with myself if I make a mistake.
I love that. The lost art, Mr. Bishop. I love that. Okay, let's talk about, I want to talk about F1 very quickly. There's so much to bloody cover. Can you take us back to one of your most notable F1 racing scoops? 1997, McLaren, reliability issues, and a very famous photo of a third brake input.
Yeah, well, a third pedal and a second brake input, to be precise. So that was in 1997, and the credit should go to my friend and colleague at the time, Darren Heath, who was and may still be one of the greatest photographers who's ever taken cameras to Formula One races. The reason I say and may still be is that he's now moved to New Zealand and doesn't do Formula One races anymore, but perhaps he will in the future. I think COVID got in the way and made it rather difficult, kind of marooned him down under. But anyway, we're going back now 25 years, exactly 25 years. And we were both on F1 racing. I was the editor-in-chief and he was the chief photographer. And we were mates and we worked hard together. And we had been to the Austrian Grand Prix at the A1 Ring, as it was then called, Red Bull Ring now. And in those days, of course, there was no digital photography. And Darren was going through his transparencies and he was looking through them, strips of transparency, negatives, if you like, 35 mil. And he said, Matt, come and have a look at this picture. And I looked at it when you used to use a loupe, a magnifying glass over a light box, so you could look at it like that. And I said, that's odd. We've got the rear brake discs glowing, but not the fronts. He said, exactly. You never see that because of the weight. When a car is braking hard, the weight distribution goes to the front, and you're always going to get the front discs glowing as well as the rears, or sometimes only the fronts. So I said, that's odd, isn't it? He said, what's even odder is that it is on the exit of a corner, not the entry. I said, mate, you've got to be wrong. There's no way that any car is going to have its brake discs glowing on the exit of a corner when it's under hard acceleration. He said, mate, I promise you, that is the Lauda curve, which is a third gear left-hander, and that is Häkkinen and Coulthard both accelerating hard, and they're the only cars, the two McLarens are the only ones who are exhibiting this. So we began to realize we were onto something, and we didn't know if it was legal or illegal at that time. In fact, it turned out to be legal and ingenious. But we did some research, and I'm still not going to say, even 25 years later, exactly who gave us the tip-off, but it was somebody who did give us the tip-off that told us what they have is a secondary brake pedal. So they have three pedals, because of course the clutch is a hand clutch, even back in those days. So there's three pedals in the footwell, and one of them, there's a little fiddle brake, and it is switchable from left to right, and it works on the rear brake discs. And what it's used to do is to trim understeer away under acceleration. So on the inside rear wheel, you just brake it a little bit to tuck the car in and stop the understeer. And Häkkinen was particularly good at it, apparently. Anyway, we thought, we've got a great story here, but what we need to do is find a picture of the footwell. How can we do that? And so the next race was at the Nürburgring, and Darren was doing photographs, Darren Heap, and he blagged a paddock scooter from Jordan, actually, and he had that ready with him so that if either of the Mercedes-powered McLarens broke down, and they did break down quite a lot in those days, he would be there. And it so happened that they both broke down. They both broke down at the end of the pit straight at the same time, when they were leading first and second. Apart from anything else, incredible embarrassment to the Mercedes top brass, all present, of course, in Germany. Anyway, I called Darren, but he'd already worked it out, and he was heading off as fast as he could on the Jordan bike. Got there before the marshals were there to push the cars to a safer place. I thought, am I going to be able to do this? Don't know. Ran up to David Coulthard's car, couldn't get his camera into the footwell because David had replaced his steering wheel, and he just couldn't get his camera down into the gap. Yeah. But fortunately, Häkkinen, in his enormous frustration, because he was leading and Coulthard was second, Häkkinen, in his enormous frustration, had not replaced the steering wheel, which, by the way, he should have been fined for, but never was. Anyway, he didn't, which left an aperture enough for Darren to stick his camera down into the gap. Of course, again, film cameras, not digital, so he couldn't see what he was shooting. Yeah. And he kept just bracketing and changing the aperture and changing the light settings and so on, and trying like mad to hope that he'd got a picture, because he couldn't see what he was shooting. And then when we got it back to London, we got the films back to London, hours later, he rushed off to Metro Processing in Clerkenwell, which is where you had to do those things. And he sat and waited. And then when he brought the films back, we took it to the light box and we looked at this picture. And there was one of them, one frame that was absolutely perfect. And it showed throttle pedal, brake pedal, secondary brake.
Unbelievable.
And we published it. And it was an absolutely great scoop. And for a monthly magazine to be able to scoop daily newspapers and indeed weekly equivalents such as Autosport magazine was a great thing. And it made Darren Heath's name, to be fair, as well.
Unbelievable, mate. Unbelievable. What a brilliant story, and what a brilliant storyteller, Mr. Bishop. Can you talk to me about, so you were at McLaren through 2007 where Lewis Hamilton first joined?
No, I joined at the very end of 2007. My first day, I agreed to join on 2007, and my first day was January the 1st, 2008.
There you go. Yeah. So you saw the whirling dervish that was a rookie Lewis Hamilton, and the ensuing carnage between him and El Plan, Mr. Alonso. How much or little were you involved in kind of doing one of these and parting them as they carried on?
Not at all, because I was a journalist then. That was in 2007. Annus Horribilis, with the $100 million fine and all that. That was
I'm mixing up my timing. Yeah,
but that was actually the reason I joined. I mean, Ron Dennis was having a terrible time at the hands of Ferrari, who were complaining, and the FIA, who were regulating the sport. But let's be honest, there was no love lost between the then president, Max Mosley, and the then boss of McLaren, Ron Dennis. There was no love lost at all.
Absolutely.
And Ron realized that he needed some kind of strategic comms director stroke spin doctor. And he had to have somebody who knew the sport. He had to have somebody who knew the FIA. He had to have somebody who knew the journalists concerned, and he had to have somebody he knew and trusted. So it turned out there was only one person. It was pure luck on my part. And he hired me. And I started work on the 1st of January 2008. But I was intimately involved, obviously, in understanding Spygate, as we called it, the season before, and had to report on it for F1 Racing. And had, deep talks with Ron Dennis about it. And indeed Max Mosley, for that matter. So I was... doing a job as a journalist. And then, of course, I ended up doing a job for Ron to try to damage limit and repair the horrendous results of the 2007 season, where, Lewis all but won the World Championship, missed out by 1 point to Kimi Raikkonen, but McLaren did score more points than Ferrari and would therefore have been Constructors' Championships, but had that taken away, owing to the whole Spygate issue, which was 780 pages of Ferrari IP found in the possession of the McLaren designer engineer, Mike Coughlin. So this was a huge issue. It was a police issue. It was a massive media issue. And when I got to McLaren, we were just trying to, keep the show on the road and do some damage limitation. And guess what? We did. I arrived at McLaren and everyone was shell-shocked, absolutely, knocked for six, but couldn't quite believe, yes, we have survived. We've had to pay our $100 million fine, $100 million, a huge amount of money then, an absolutely enormous amount of money then. But guess what? We went down to Australia for the first race and we won. Lewis Hamilton won. And, that was my first race for McLaren. I went down there and Lewis Hamilton won. But the mood among my colleagues who had had that terrible year and who had wondered whether the team they worked for and loved was going to survive, the mood among them was one of tearful euphoria. And it was infectious. And we'd won. We'd won, and we'd beaten Ferrari, the old enemy. And then there were a few more races. Ferrari won them again. And then we got to Monaco, always the jewel in the crown. And we won again, Lewis Hamilton. And if you remember that race, the 2008 Monaco Grand Prix, one of the great races in terrible weather conditions. And Lewis, I think, had already shown himself to be a fantastic driver. But on that day, on Monaco, on the streets of Monaco in 2008, I think he showed himself to be already one of the all-time greats. And my goodness, over the past 14 years, he's underlined that. And absolutely wonderful driver, as good as we've ever seen. And personally, I think a great guy. I have a huge amount of time for him. I worked with him closely for 5 years. I think he has a very good heart, and I think he's a kind man. And he's now, he's 37, isn't he? Yeah. He's now embraced a whole load of interests outside of motor racing. And I think that what happens now to Lewis, whether he wins another Grand Prix, whether he wins another World Championship or not, I think what happens now to Lewis over the next 40 or 50 years will be fascinating, because I think he could be hugely successful, influential, and important in what he achieves off track, just as he has been in what he achieves on track. And by the way, I would say the same for Sebastien Vettel, who I now work with. But both of them use their platform, their fame, in order to do something which, without being too grandiose, I'm going to describe as follows. I think they actually want to improve things for humankind. And, you can't knock them for that. That's a wonderful ambition. And I think they both achieve it.
Love that, Matt. We're going to come on to that in a second. You're ticking all the boxes, Matt, in singular answers. What am I going to do with you? So just to zoom back in on Lewis 2008 for a second. And again, I completely agree with everything that you said. Generational talent. For me, my subjectivity, the best peddler that I've ever seen. Talk to me about 2008, Brazil. The end of that race. One of the, if not the greatest climax of any F1 championship that I've ever seen. Like, what were in the closing laps of that Grand Prix, Matt? Talk us through the feelings and the emotions.
So I was in the garage, and we were we were obviously in contention for the World Championship with Felipe Massa Ferrari. And Felipe was leading the race. And you have to, by the way, just put this in context for Felipe, who I have a lot of time for. He was leading his home Grand Prix in the city in which he had been born, in a Ferrari. And at that point, as things stood, he was about to win the World Championship. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. It doesn't get much better than that. And as he was reeling off those laps, he was thinking, I'm going to do this. And his family was there. His dad was in the garage, all his school friends. One of the all-time great achievements that would have been. And then we know what happened, because Lewis had to be fifth to nick the World Championship, but he was sixth. And it was actually Sebastien Vettel ahead of him in the Toro Rosso that Lewis was trying to overtake, but he couldn't overtake him. I remember sitting in the garage just shouting, "Come on, Lewis, come on." Not that I could hear myself. The engines of the cars were very loud then, but I knew I was shouting because the next day I'd lost my voice. And of course, Lewis couldn't get past until, and you couldn't make it up, could you? And by the way, I'll get emotional thinking about it. But the last corner of the last lap of the last race of the season, not Vettel, but Glock in the Toyota was going slow ahead. And both Seb Vettel and Lewis Hamilton swooped past him on that last corner, and we were fifth. Ahead, Felipe Massa was already celebrating his World Championship with all the associated emotion. His family there, his friends there, his home city, in a Ferrari. And gradually it dawned on them, and I think you can see the footage on YouTube, where in the garage, his father is absolutely, punching the air with joy. And then he suddenly realizes Lewis is fifth, not sixth. And you just see human frailty in the roar. You see the look of abject horror pass his face, and then the people he's with him. And then one of the Ferrari mechanics headbutts the monitor and smashes it to smithereens. I mean, an extraordinary sporting moment. Anyway, after that, we were completely over the moon, just could not believe it. And if you ever see sporting euphoria, whatever sport it is, whether it's somebody scoring the winning goal in the World Cup final, or it's somebody hitting the winning runs in an Ashes test match, or it's somebody breasting the tape first to win an Olympic gold medal in the 100 meters. Whatever it is, that emotion is irreplaceable and unfakeable. You just, whoever you see, you have to hug. Absolutely. And you're just pouring with tears. And that's how we felt. And I remember taking Lewis from all the TV crews to TV crews, and it was pandemonium in the tiny, cramped and congested Interlagos paddock. And then throughout all that melee and chaos, this little figure in red approached. Yeah, and I mean, I have to pay tribute to Felipe Massa here. He just kind of squeezed his way through and put his hand up, and he said, "Well done, Lewis. Can I shake your hand?" And, you know, what a sportsman. What a fantastic occasion. But it's often described as Lewis Hamilton's triumph, and it was. But it's also a story that, for me, places Felipe Massa among the greats.
Wow. Bloody Nora, Matt. Bringing grown man to tears out here. Okay. I've heard you tell a story about, you spoke to Lewis's character, and that was amazing, by the way. You spoke to Lewis's character outside of the cockpit, and you tell a really touching story about a phone call that Lewis had with your old lady when she was ill. Do you mind regurgitating that, Matt?
I will. So this was, my mother had cancer, terminal cancer, and she was an author. She was a novelist, and Lewis was aware of that. Most people in Formula One were aware of that she was a novelist, an author, and she had cancer. So, Matt Bishop's mum is in a bad way, and she's probably going to die soon. So that was the situation, and I'm talking about 2012 now. And I was briefing Lewis. I was giving him a media briefing at one of the races. Can't remember which, but anyway, so I was briefing him, and then Ron Dennis, McLaren boss, called me away. And I went away, and I said, "Lewis, just stay there, will you? Just for a minute, mate. Just stay there. Ron wants me, but I'll be back in a minute." I left my phone there. And without my knowing, I was literally gone for 45 seconds, a minute. But without my knowing, my phone had rung while I was away. And Lewis spotted it, and it said, "Mum." So Lewis took it upon himself to answer it. And I didn't know this at the time, because when I came back, Lewis didn't tell me. I just carried on with the media briefing. But my mum rang me later, and she said, "That Lewis Hamilton's a very nice boy." I said, "Yeah, he is. Mum, what are you on about?" And she said, "Well, I spoke to him earlier today." I thought, oh, my God. "Yeah, of course you did, Mum. How are you, by the way?" She said, no, honestly, I did.
Oh, bless her.
And she explained. She said, "Yes, he said that you'd been called away." And he said he answered the phone because he saw the word "mum" on the phone as it was ringing. And he said, "Mrs. Bishop, I just want to say to you, you should be very proud of your son, Matt. He does great work with us, with me and Jensen. He's a good guy. He's very good at his job. And I know you're not having a great time of it yourself. I know you're fighting cancer. So I just wanted to answer the phone and pass on my best regards." And that's why he answered the phone. Anyway, I found out about that when she told me later that day or the next day. Fast forward a year. Now I'm still at McLaren, 2013. Lewis has now moved to Mercedes. So we're no longer in the same team. There's no possible way that I can benefit him. So the only reason he did what I'm going to describe is because he's a nice person. Not because he was trying to impress me or gain advantage in the eyes of someone who was a senior in the team, just because of the decent human being that he is. So she died, and it was the Thursday before the German Grand Prix, and I telephoned my colleagues at McLaren and said, "Look, I'm not going to be able to make the race because my mum's just died. She just died this afternoon." So as you'd imagine, people began to say, "Oh, have you heard? Poor old Matt Bishop, his mum died today." So I started getting the odd text message from people saying, "I'm so sorry to hear that, mate." And then later in the evening, it was 10 o'clock in the UK, in London, where my mother lived. and 11 o'clock in Germany. And I was sitting in my mother's house, and my mother's body was still there, hadn't been taken away. It was going to be taken away the next morning. And I was sitting there. She was lying there. My brother, my cousins, neighbors, friends, my stepfather, her second husband, all there, having a drink and talking about what a great lady she was. And then my phone went. And of course, Lewis Hamilton has quite a distinctive first name, and everybody knew what I did for a living. So, I picked up the phone and I went, "Hello, Lewis." So suddenly there's silence in the room. "Oh, Lewis Hamilton." So I said, "Lewis, hi." He said, "Hello, Matt." I said, I'm not in Hockenheim." He said, "I know you're not in Hockenheim. I've just heard this minute," and this was 11 o'clock at night. "I've just heard this minute that your mother passed away today. I just wanted to call you straight away and tell you that I wanted to pass on my condolences. Are you with your family, by the way, Matt?" I said, I am. He said, "Could you please pass on my condolences to each and every one of them, and also tell them that I will remember your mother in my prayers tonight." What a guy, eh? What a guy.
Mate, what an absolute legend, and what a story. And bless Mrs. Bishop.
This is the side of Lewis people don't see. They see the Instagram side. They see, the side with all the tattoos and all the fancy clothes. And there's nothing wrong with any of that, by the way. In fact, I think it's very cool, and it's up to him. But, people who are negative about Lewis and slag him off on social media, personally, I think I tell that story because I want people to understand the man he is, which is a very, very decent man and a very good man.
Incredible, Mr. Bishop. As we round third base, could I stretch you another 5 minutes, or have you got a... Thank you so much, mate. You've been more than generous with this time. There's two follow-up questions that I want to talk to you about, and also very pertinent issues as far as F1 and the world, right? So, firstly, Matt, if we speak to... In fact, let's speak to your circumstances. A openly gay man in a very masculine linear sport, let's say, as far as the demographic of the people who have historically been involved. Matt, talk to the challenges of being an editor at F1 Racing and now in a very influential job in an F1 team, no less. Talk to the challenges of being an openly gay man in a position of power in a very I want to say misogynistic, but that's not the word, masculine sport, and how you've overcome those ultimately, because I think that's an important point to bring out.
Well, look, I think Formula One, motorsport, is by and large, still is, and always has been, a very white, male, heterosexual area of human activity. Always has been. And even now, by the way, very few people of colour. Obviously, we've been talking about Lewis Hamilton, and he is absolutely one, but very few others, no other drivers, and not that many other people of colour who work in Formula One teams either. There are some, of course, and there are some in the media corps as well. There are women, but very few senior women, very few. Mostly they work in PR and marketing and catering jobs. And by the way, if they work in PR and marketing, they're generally not the most senior. Some of them are, but generally they're not. And they're few in number. And as for sexuality, well, when I arrived in Formula One 30 years ago, I was the only gay in the Formula One village, apparently. I obviously wasn't. The rest of them, what small number there may have been, must have been closeted, must have been in hiding, must have been secretive. But I decided not to be. And I did encounter some homophobia early on. I'm talking about in the 90s and early noughties particularly. And I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail about it, just because just because I don't want to name names, and I don't see the point of naming names when it's 20 or 30 years ago. And I'm sure the people concerned would not adopt the same tone or attitude now, because the world has moved on. But when I started, I was the only one, and it was seen as an eccentricity, perhaps something to be hushed up, and perhaps something, slightly embarrassing. Matt Bishop's gay. But I decided not to. I didn't scream about it from the rooftops, but I just decided to be open and honest. I think that's all one can ever be in one's life, about everything. And as the years have rolled past, life has changed. There are still parts of the world, and we race in some parts of the world, where being LGBTQ+, particularly being a gay man, is a huge challenge. And that's a whole other subject. But in the Western world, certainly, and where I live, in the United Kingdom, in London, things have changed very much for the better. And in Formula One, they have. And in 2019, together with a few others, Richard Morris, the young racing driver, being principal among them, I was one of the founders of an organisation called Racing Pride, which we inaugurated in association with Stonewall, which is a great LGBTQ+ charity. And we did so because we thought there was still work to be done to help people who are LGBTQ+ in motorsport, whether they be young karters, go-karters, who might be struggling with their sexuality or not quite knowing because of the developmental path that we all take when we're 12, 13, 14, 15. Some surer about who they are and whom they want to love, and some quicker to come to a happy equilibrium about that, but some struggling, and no fault to any either type, if you like, or any of those types. But to make sure that karting, junior karting, welcomes people, whoever they are, whether they are LGBTQ or indeed plus, whether they are male or female, or prefer to be known as they. And again, people sometimes lampoon this stuff. Why? My view on this is live and let live. Let people be who they want to be.
Absolutely, mate.
Anyway, so there's that side of it. And then there's also the perhaps mechanics and engineers. And I think in general, it's people in those professions that probably find it hardest to be open about who they are in Formula One and motorsport. And they might be in their 30s, 40s, or even 50s. And they might find it hard to come out because let's say they've worked for Williams or McLaren or Ferrari for 15 years. And they've been working alongside and perhaps even rooming with the same fellow mechanics and engineers for 15 years. Rather more difficult to come out than if you just arrive. People fear that they will say, well, why didn't you ever tell me before? I've known you for 15 years, mate.
Yeah.
And I began to get anonymous emails, not from people's McLaren or Williams or Ferrari accounts, but from their Gmail accounts, or going back in the past, even their CompuServe accounts, going back, that dates it, saying, I know you're out, I see you, I wish I could be, I don't feel I'm able to be. And sometimes you could never force somebody or really even coerce somebody, but you can encourage somebody to say, look, you could come out and maybe this is one of the ways in which you might want to approach it. And if that has happened, and the result is that the person feels better about themselves and their colleagues feel happier about them because they probably always thought there was something secret about John or Dave or Steve or whoever it was. And the result is then that this mechanic or engineer is a happier and more collaborative colleague. Ultimately, what actually happens is that he, because it is usually he in Formula One, he works better and makes fewer mistakes. And the result is that the car he's working on goes faster. So I sometimes, as a Racing Pride person, I go to teams and say, you do realize that if you embrace this properly, you'll make your car go faster. And I firmly believe that. There's lap time in the generous acceptance of diversity and inclusivity.
You smashed it, mate. Holy smokes, that's incredible. And then lastly, in fact, if I can ask you two more, Matt, I know I'm encroaching on your time massively
Right.
there. Firstly, as a follow-up to that question, what can I do as a heterosexual man to be an ally of marginalised people broadly? Again, so I understand the ethnic minority stuff, being a black man living in the UK of Jamaican heritage, but there are other marginalised people to whom I can be an ally to. So what's your advice to me, Matt? What can I do on social media, in real life, to kind of crystallise myself as an ally and do some actual good for other marginalised people, gay and other?
Yeah, look, it's a lovely question. It's a lovely question. It does you credit that you ask it. I think the word ally is the word you use and is the key here. And yeah, certainly Lewis Hamilton is an ally. Certainly Sebastien Vettel is an ally. Other drivers as well. I'd also like to just do a shout out here to Mick Schumacher, who's young, but also is an ally. You know, these are heterosexual men who stick up for and speak out on behalf of the LGBTQ plus community everywhere they race, and also inside the world of motorsport. So, you know, two multiple world champions in their mid-late 30s and one near rookie. So, you know, I think we should also pay tribute to Mick Schumacher there too. So I think it's important to be an ally. And you can be an ally whether you're a fan in motorsport, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a blogger, whether you're a YouTuber, whether you are working in marketing or catering or comms or journalism or a mechanic or an engineer. And I think you can do it just in the ways that you are doing it. I mean, you are, by the way, interviewing me and asking me questions on this subject. And, you know, that will be seen by people and you will be seen to have facilitated that. I think liking people's tweets, you know, resharing their social posts, perhaps even pronouns, you know, put on your emails signed off, you know, he, him, like people do sometimes, she, her. Why do you need to do that? You don't need to do it. But if I receive an email from somebody who writes she, her, or he, him, they may well be heterosexual, but I know straight away that they are going to be a person who's going to be accepting of me. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put that there. So I think that's the kind of thing you can do. You know, Lewis Hamilton retweeted something I tweeted a couple of years ago about an LGBTQ plus issue. Now, first of all, that was a fun thing to do because it meant that because it meant that my tweet was seen by 6 million people, which I can assure you they aren't usually. But also, why did he do it? He did it, you know, probably he got some grief for doing it because some people probably among his fan base said, what are you doing that for? Tweeting, you know, that gay man's thing. He certainly didn't do it to be cool. He's a youngish, cool dude. And I'm an old, bald gay man. You know, he certainly didn't share it in order to look cool. He shared it because he believed in what I had to say.
Absolutely.
And he didn't care who knew it. And I think those are the things you can do. And there's one other thing, and this is a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder, but it's absolutely valid. If you overhear people making homophobic or, by the way, sexist remarks, just as I should do the same if I overhear someone making homophobic or sexist or indeed racist remarks, or even phraseology that just bespeaks a little bit, a tinge of those things, I think it's cool to say, excuse me, mate, I prefer you didn't say that. I'm going to talk about another sport now. I don't know if you like cricket, but there's the Joe Root. So Joe Root is the England batsman, was the captain until recently. And he was being sledged, I think, by an Australian slip fielder who used a pejorative term about I don't know what the term was, but it was one of the slang words about being gay, whatever it might have been, because cricketers sledge each other to put off the batsman. And you could hear it on the broadcast. He just walked over. This is a straight man, Joe Root. He walked over to the slip fielder and said, "There's nothing wrong with being gay, mate." And that must have taken a bit of courage. And it completely silenced the sledging fielder because it was the right thing to say. So I think there's always an opportunity to either stand up and be counted or not. And if you can, please do.
Love that, Matt. You've answered my last one before I even asked it. I was going to ask you, what is there a place for sportsmen in politics per Mr. Vettel's appearance on Newsnight? But you've bloody nailed it preemptively, haven't you?
Well, I was very pleased to get him on Newsnight.
Incredible.
No Formula One driver's ever been on Newsnight, or no active Formula One driver. And, he'd never heard of Newsnight, but I explained to him why I thought it might be a good idea. I sent him a few YouTube links and he watched them. He said, "Yeah, I think I can do that." We briefed very carefully because, he didn't know very much about Partygate,
Absolutely.
Boris Johnson. He didn't know that much about the intricacies of Brexit, but he is interested in the world at large. And he's an intelligent man. Of course, he speaks English superbly well. So I think he knocked it out of the park. I think he did a great job. Whether or not he's going to be a politician, no, he may well not be, just as Lewis may well not be. But I think that they will be, for want of a better term, I think they will both be active, and perhaps even activists, but certainly active. In much the same way as one of the all-time sporting heroes, Muhammad Ali, was not a politician, but was active, and perhaps even an activist, I think you'd have to say, and achieved a huge amount for humankind.
Oh, Mr. Bishop, you're a legend. Making a change, right? Effecting substantial change in the world. And I think if we all stand up and do some of the things that you advise, then the world will be a better place for it. Look at that. F1 chat turned into a bigger, more profound social comment. I love that. Mr. Bishop, you've been more than kind of your time. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege and an honour. So is there anything that you want to promote? At the Bish F1 on Twitter. You on Instagram? I haven't seen your Insta. You're just a Twitter guy, aren't you?
Really, yeah. I do have an Instagram, but no. At the Bish F1 on Twitter. If you want to buy The Boy Made the Difference, please feel free to do so. And I'm happy to say, even if you don't like it, I don't have to feel guilty because your money will have gone to a great charity, which is Young Lives versus Cancer.
Absolutely, all for a good cause. Those links, of course, are in the description so you can purchase, as well as Matt's Twitter. Matt, it's been a privilege and an honour, sir. Gonna have to do it again at some point, as and when your schedule allows. Rate, review if you could, please, and also you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe. It really helps the channel and it facilitates more important conversations like this. Signing off, guys. As always, look but never stare. See you on the next one. Peace.